Okay, great. Um, well, thanks, Jarryd, for taking the time to meet with me. And I was uh, recommended I contact you through Lataf, the curator at the Australian National Bonsai Collection. And so I'm aware of you. I've heard your name around. I've heard of your podcast, but I haven't had a chance to meet you or chat with you in person. And so um, part of the goal of this conversation is really trying to explore what bonsai looks like in various countries throughout the world, kind of inspired by the upcoming World Cup in 2026 that's happening in the US. This idea of kind of nationality kind of being on display and through soccer and through sport. And I was thinking about bonsai and if there are ways that we can kind of look around and see any distinct representations of kind of national identity in bonsai. I think we can see that in Japan and China and some other countries, but kind of
Mm.
looking at what it looks like in Australia or, Italy or the US, and like understand kind of if there are ways we can kind of point to some key features that might identify what Australian bonsai or Tasmanian bonsai, if that's even a thing. And so I'm talking to people who are there, who kind of are more aware of what that would look like, to just get a sense of that. And so, yeah, maybe just to start out, kind of setting the stage for kind of just how you got into bonsai briefly and kind of how you got to where you are right now.
Yeah, yeah, I saw that. That's a good starting question. It's the common starting question with
Yeah.
amongst bonsai people. So my introduction to bonsai was sort of just a life collision. I had a next door neighbor. His family bought a big collection of trees from a deceased estate. So, we'd often hang out of an afternoon after school. One day I just walked onto his back veranda and yeah, a big collection of bonsai, and I was sort of struck by that. And yeah, eventually got my own little tree, a little native ficus, and they're pretty indestructible. So, I got to go through all the trials and tribulations early on with a pretty indestructible tree, which has amazingly survived to this day. Yeah, so yeah, that all began about at the age of 12. So it's been a sort of a bit of a time ago now. Yeah, so that's how it all sort of kicked off.
So you've been doing bonsai for like what, 10 years, 15 years, 25? I don't think you're that old.
No, no, but yeah, so I'm 35 now. So the maths of that, what's that, 23 years?
Yeah.
Been doing bonsai now. Yeah. I
Well,
did like
that's
my 10 years that made me feel like I'm looking youthful, but that's definitely not the case.
that's great. So how would you describe, then, having been doing bonsai for this long, like what would you describe as your own personal style or approach to bonsai today?
Hmm. I think initially I just started out like everyone, just plagiarizing, you know, cutting
Hmm.
my teeth and trialing to do, what copy what I saw, found things that I liked and tried to replicate. But as I've sort of found my own feet in the art, I think if I had to put a title on what I do, it's more, I think I've heard other people talk about my work and they've called it naturalistic, but I think it's maybe more like stylized naturalism is what I would probably, if I was to put a label on it myself. I think it's not 100% naturalistic in its form. So I do probably take a little bit of the element of chaos out of things that the natural world inherently has. Yeah.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, can you expand a little bit on what you mean by naturalism? Like, can you unpack that a little bit more?
Yeah, yeah. It's a bit of it can be a throwaway term in bonsai. Sometimes it can be used as a derogative term. Some people think that naturalistic style of bonsai can be lazy. Really well produced, stylistically produced natural bonsai. They really, it takes a lot of work to create something that looks like not a lot of work has been done at times. Yeah, and it can be either. So I think, but generally speaking, that term I think just refers to a tree as a bonsai that looks like a tree in nature. Yeah, and I think in my own work, I try to do that, but also I've found that sometimes, the reason I say stylistically is I don't just pick any old tree to work off. I think you could look at 1,000 trees and maybe one is inspiring of that species, and maybe you find 5,000 trees and then you find five trees that you find inspiring, and then you draw out the aesthetic from that. And so I think that's where it's like not every chaotic looking wild tree is as beautiful as each other, I guess. Um, yeah. So I think as well, and I think as well because I found because it's a sculptural art and you're sort of trying, like as the composer of the sculpture, you're trying to direct the eye at the viewer to sort of flow through it and stuff. So sometimes you strip away a bit of the chaos just to make the consumption of that image a bit easier.
Yeah, yeah, that's really interesting. I'm curious to hear then, what do you feel then that approach, that kind of naturalistic style kind of does that express something more personal about you and kind of your relationship to nature, your relationship to trees, how you see trees? Like, I guess, is there something personal about that as well?
Yeah, yeah, 100%. I think with anyone that's, doing bonsai, they have a personal link to what it is that they're trying to do. I think for me, like I've always been sort of like outdoorsy. My parents owned a camping and hiking and adventure store when I was a kid. So, and I lived right on the back of an area that backed right onto bushland. So I've always sort of like adventured out into those sort of spaces and done a lot of fishing and stuff. It's kind of funny as a fisherman, good fishing often correlates to undisturbed landscapes where there's a healthy ecosystem. Um, so you find if you live in a domestic area, you're often, if you're going out fishing in the mountains, you push further and further out, the fishing will be better. But then I'm doing bonsai and I'm observing trees, and oftentimes, um, yeah, oftentimes in these sort of old growth areas, the trees are more beautiful than say a younger tree, and it sort of gets really to the heart of what it is. I think a lot of the time we're trying to do with bonsai. So I think to round out the thought. Yeah, I think in my work, like my personal work, not the work I'm creating for, sort of business purposes. I think in my own personal work, it's more about my enjoyment of time in the wilderness and the beauty of those spaces, and trying to share those experiences. Yeah.
So the you were fishing as a child, like that was kind of a early exposure to kind of nature in that way. You sort of
Yeah.
did that before bonsai.
Yeah, and I ended up doing like a marine science degree at university, sort of following that sort of, because sort of you get to the end of high school and you're thinking, what am I going to do? And it's like, well, could either, maybe move into architecture or, I could go into some kind of business type thing or, and then I was just kind of like, I do like fishing.
You
So,
like to fish, go
maybe,
in the marine
yeah,
marine environment.
yeah.
Yeah, I see
And,
the
I've always
connection.
been, yeah, interested in like conservation and stuff. So like I worked sort of in fisheries and stuff for a little while and aquaculture and that sort of stuff. Yeah.
Were there any trees that you saw while you were in your young fishing days that kind of stick with you, or you kind of hold on to those images as a source of inspiration, or anything that kind of like anything that a tree either from your past or even like a bonsai that kind of is especially meaningful to you that might kind of represent this feeling that or style that you're speaking of?
Yeah, when I was younger, certainly like my first bonsai was a ficus tree, and then in the paddock, over, one side I had bushland, and then the other side was pastoral land with a nice sort of creek that ran through it. So I'd go down to that creek to either like, go for fish or try and catch little things for my aquarium and whatnot. There was a big paddock style ficus, people often refer to it as banyan style, big open, broad spreading canopy, and we used to climb that tree a lot. So I think initially that was one of my first trees that I connected with.
Mm.
Yeah, but over time, like it's certainly changed. Because I live in a very different part of the country now to where I grew up. So yeah, but I think early on, those sort of like estuarine habitats where like there were water swept trees or maybe paddock forms where you'd be going through areas of pastoral land to get to those areas or yeah, temperate rainforest, sorry, tropical rainforest trees in that area as well. Pretty inspiring early on.
Yeah, so you're describing trees as paddock trees. I've never heard that term used before. Can you explain what that means?
Yeah, maybe you guys use the term field, like an open
Okay.
space where a tree would
Okay.
grow broad. It has no
Hmm.
competition. So grows very differently to a forest tree because it has the space to do so. Um, yeah, so in Australia, like especially in the sort of subtropical and tropical areas, one of the kings of the jungle, for lack of a better term, is the ficus tree. So in a forest form, they grow as a strangler fig, and they'll be emergent from the canopy because they land in the top of fairly significant tree and then strangle it and then emerge from the canopy as sort of like the biggest trees in the forest. And then often they were left when they cleared that land, that sort of forest for pastoral land, for so like grazing land. And the trees that remained then would either get broad or were planted and became broad. So they're really big, really aesthetically pleasing trees.
Mhm.
Yeah, a bit like the oaks you guys have in California.
Yeah,
Um,
that's what I was just thinking, kind of that kind of open, wide open kind of space for a tree to kind of grow in a fairly, not harsh environment, right?
yeah,
Um,
yeah,
yeah,
things are
well,
pleasant trees.
yeah, kind of peaceful, serene. Yeah, well, I guess it's kind of a good transition to kind of talk a little bit about um, kind of the natural landscape that you kind of exist in currently, and how would you describe that?
Yeah, so I'd say that Tasmania is one of the great, if I had to use a single word, you said a single word, I'd say wilderness. So
Hmm.
here there is like, there's great wild spaces, almost if you look at a map, it looks like half of the state is national park,
Mm.
when that's not necessarily true, if you do look at it and you look at like land degradation on this island, or you just look, the easiest way to look at it is look at Australia. More or less, it looks pretty red, unless you look at the southwest corner or along the east coast. And then you look at the island of Tasmania, which lies off the bottom of Australia. Um, it's a green little island, Um, yeah, and there's a lot of space that's not been developed because it's sort of very the mountains are small, but they're very numerous and quite jagged. And so it's very harsh terrain out there. But quite inhospitable to like human settlement. So yeah, in Tassie we sort of live on the south and eastern and northern coastlines, and then through the center and southwest it's just wilderness.
Yeah, so I mean, not really familiar with Tasmania from a from much of a standpoint. So I mean, how does Tasmania exist in relationship to Australia? What are the cultural kind of connections there? Like, how do Australians view Tasmania? Like, is there a thing like help me kind of understand that? Because I mean, you were born in Australia and then moved to Tasmania? Is that correct?
Yeah, yeah. So Tasmania is it's an island state of Australia.
Okay.
So the vast majority of the states are on continental Australia. Tasmania is separated by the Bass Strait. Yeah, so I grew up on the sort of eastern coast. So sort of northern New South Wales is so we got the Queensland up north, New South Wales, and then Victoria below that. So grew up on the East Coast, and then after university, I moved down to Tasmania, sort of for work, but I fell in love with the landscape because it was very different. Still very green where I grew up, but very green down here. And yeah, this place is like very unique globally from a like a botanical perspective. We have really the only ancient trees on the Australian continent. Well, there are some on the Australian continent. This is a global hotspot for ancient trees, and also, we have the largest flowering trees in the world here, tallest. So it's a bit like your West Coast in America, where you've got this like, sort of hotspot for ancient trees as well. But it's contained in one small island off the bottom. So culturally, very similar to Australia. I think it's interesting. I was reading through some of your later questions, but one of the things that is a hard thing when you talk about Australian style is that Australia is so big. So we do have, much like in America, you have different accents for different states. There's to a lesser extent, that still exists here. It's not as pronounced.
Hmm.
But yeah, culturally very, very similar, but sometimes in Australia, Tasmania gets left off the map.
Hmm. Hmm.
And some of us like it that way as well.
Yeah, so I mean, does Tasmania kind of attract a certain type of individual, someone who's looking to exist in that, environment where it's maybe a little more remote, a little bit harsher, a little less developed, or suburbanized? Like, what type of person is drawn to Tasmania or lives there? Is it probably different from the mainland, right?
Yeah, I think so. I think economically it's not as strong. So like a lot of people don't move here necessarily for work, even though both me and my partner did. Um, I'd say it has, in some respects, that same allure as, like Alaska or Canada. Some has a bit of a draw, that sort of like lure of the wild. There is an element of that here, but the landscape's not as vast. But they've kept it kind of inaccessible, so you do have to work hard to get out and see it. Um, yeah, but it's an interesting place culturally. It's very divided politically. With respects to those who lean into the preservational or conservational camp with respects to politics, and then the other side of politics of maybe like jobs and growth and exploitation of those resources and stuff. So it's quite a polarized state in that respect. There's not that there's much of a middle ground as you might find in other places.
That's interesting. Yeah, I want to ask you this question too, and I think our conversation can kind of just flow a little bit because I interviewed another Australian bonsai professional, and I got the impression that there kind of is this pretty that there's a strong divide within even bonsai within Australia. So I'm really interested to hear about what bonsai looks like in Australia from your perspective. And this kind of division that seemed to exist almost between like the uh, traditional approach and then more of a more and the focus on exotic species and then this focus on native plants and there's almost like a devaluing of native plants for bonsai in Australia and it seems like that kind of you're touching on this tension between people's view of the environment as like a good thing or a bad thing or like what is like the role of the environment in Australia like how do Australians like interact with their environment is something I'm really interested to understand more of so yeah what are your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I was loving that question to unpack. Um, I'll start with the first part of the question about sort of that division of like traditional, or I sort of think of it as like a classical approach to bonsai
Mm-hmm.
using Japanese species. Um, and that's where I began more or less, even though my first plant was a native tree. Um, I think we all sort of, because there wasn't a pre-existing bonsai culture here, we learnt more or less from external sources, like a lot of cultures do. And there was this pedestal type approach to like, the Japanese approach. And we also had a lot of influx of philosophy that came from like John Naka, and even Yoshimura. So from your neck of the woods. And in more recent times with the internet, we've had more global inputs. But again, it's been a reverential perspective towards things like black pines or maple or whatnot. And it's an interesting thing culturally. Yeah, I think well, they've said that natives were not particularly good for bonsai for a lot of years, that sort of camp. But then there's also been people for a long time using native species. Um, Yeah, so it is divided, but they all go to the bonsai clubs together and but sometimes, yeah, there's some people think that the native tree is not worth time but then from the people that like to use native trees, sometimes they'll devalue you know, I I even do it sometimes, like you use that word like maybe earlier, like a plagiaristic approach. That's sort of a word that has a negative connotation attached to it. So I think from both sides of the camp, I think that just comes down to what people like and don't like. I personally think that we'll find more of our voice through working with our native trees than we will because, if I say I have international people come to my garden, they're far more interested in the native species that I'm working with um, than, a, a Japanese black pine that might be, okay for the country, or a Japanese maple that might be really good for the country standard. But you compare that tree that's, a good Japanese maple by Australian standards to a Japanese maple bonsai that's existed for 100 years in Japan, and that's a moving train that's constantly, you're chasing it. It's sort of if you look at you putting the bonsai on the global standpoint, I think the native trees are maybe more interesting personally. Yeah, but yeah, I mean, in any place, you'll have people that don't place much value on the natural landscape. They see it as something that's there to be utilized. Um,
Yeah, that's really fascinating because, the person I was speaking to, I mean, one thing that I learned that I was kind of caught off guard by, or surprised by, I should say, was the fact that Australia has like a sort of like exclusive natives bonsai club.
oh
Like
yeah.
like to me that was surprising because it seemed like there was kind of a like either other bonsai clubs were not addressing the interest of natives enough so that like a separate kind of native specific club had to be created for that to exist, or like that had to be there to kind of meet that desire because it wasn't being met in the sort of a standard club. Whereas in the US, like I couldn't imagine having to like have a separate natives bonsai club, like because both of those things kind of exist. But so that was one thing that was kind of interesting. So maybe you could speak on that. And I think too, as the word exotic in
Mm.
use kind of like and I'd be interested to hear how you refer to the, Japanese black pine and Chinese elm, because from a botanical standpoint, exotic is the proper sort of term to describe a plant that's non-endemic, right? A non-native plant. But I don't think of a Japanese black pine in the US as like as an exotic plant. It's a black pine. But so almost drawing like that distinction from like exotic and native, kind of it just felt like there was a much kind of stronger division between the two. And from my perspective in the US, I don't see that as strong of a division within like a club or within like how you think of plants and like where they're coming from. And so I'm curious about too, like Australia, the relationship with exotic species and like the impact, of like bullfrogs brought into, Australia and kind of taking over, and like that idea of something that's could potentially disrupt the native environment,
Mm.
right? That's from
Yeah.
outside. So I could see there's like a concern or a caution of those, but then at the same time, like, you know, from never having been to Australia, I think of Australia too as very beautiful naturally, but also
Mm.
like there's box jellyfish in the water, and there's like
Yeah.
huge spiders and snakes. And so like the environment of Australia feels somewhat a little bit more threatening and like kind of unsafe, whereas I don't quite feel that same level of having never been there. But I'm saying like my perception as an outsider, so I'm curious too, as like as an Australian, like what is your relationship with the natural environment? Like, is there a sense of kind of like, mother nature as something that's potentially dangerous, or is that kind of overplayed? like is there
Mm.
like a love hate relationship? Like I'm really interested to kind of hear how do Australians, and I get you're trying to, I'm not sort of asking you to speak for your entire country, but I kind of am, at least to help
Yeah, yeah,
me
yeah.
help understand like how do people like relate to the natural environment?
Yeah. Well, there's a lot, again, so a lot of parts to that question. So the first part, like the native club aspect, and like talking about exotic trees and things like native trees maybe being overlooked, and why you wouldn't see that happen in America or Europe or other places is quite simple, really, if you just look at it from a fundamental point of view, is that traditionally in, say, China, Japan, Taiwan, Korea, you look at the bread and butter species that they're using, the common species they're using for bonsai. You've got pines, you've got maples, you've got elms, you've got junipers. You guys in Europe and North America have all of those species in your palette of materials to use for bonsai. In Australia, we don't have any of those. Um, Even things like, our pencil pines here, which are more closely related to redwoods, and they're something that exists only in Tasmania. We call them pines, but they're not true pinaceae. Yeah, so the predominant tree on the Australian continent are broadleaf evergreen trees. Um, Slightly different in Tasmania, where we have like fire refuges, which have allowed like ancient conifers, relic Gondwanan conifers to survive, and ancient landscapes to survive. So it's kind of different. Tassie's like a snapshot of like a very long time ago that's been protected since, probably prior to the last glacial period. Um, yeah, so the techniques that we were being fed in the early days, coming from the Northern Hemisphere, are in reverse. So if someone says do something in December, that can be catastrophic in Australia, right? because that's the heart of winter for the heart of summer for us and the depths of winter for you, you know. Um, yeah, so that would be one of the reasons why there is a need or a desire. The other thing is like botanically, the country is huge and we don't know what to use, you know, and there's so many species, you know, to play with. So that can be a there's a lot of people going through the trial and error of what does and doesn't work from our like local selection of plants to use for bonsai, and they're excellent for bonsai. Probably have been overlooked to some extent. And then the second part of that question was sort of about is the landscape here like terrifying? Like I hear that a lot. People think Australia is like dangerous, box jellyfish, bull sharks, you know, snakes, spiders. Um, when I was in the mountains in America, I had to carry a box to keep my food in so the bears wouldn't tear into my tent in the night and rip me apart and eat my food. You know, so I think every landscape has its element of like danger. I think sometimes when it's foreign, it can feel more dangerous. When you live in the space, it's not, you're not concerned about it. It's not like every day you're thinking, you know, will some spider end me today or that sort of thing. And Tassie's pretty safe. You know, we do have a few like, you know, we got tiger snakes and stuff like that, and you know, funnel web spiders and redback spiders and stuff. But you know, while you encounter them, if you don't, you know, poke the bear, it doesn't really cause too much issue. Maybe the landscape is a little bit less comfortable in some places in Australia too. The landscape itself can be, you know, there's certain ecosystems that are quite pleasant to be in. But if you go into what we call the bush on the mainland a lot, and that type of forest is often referred to as sclerophyll forest, kind of like scratchy and you know spiky and in a lot of places, you know. Yeah, but then there's other areas that are open and pastoral. We don't have as many things. Like I remember in your neck of the woods, there were meadows, and I thought, geez, this is pleasant. You know, you walk through the nice soft pine forest with big leaf maples and moss, and eat a handful of berries, and then go and lay down in the meadow. You know, we do that more on the coastlines because it's nice and comfortable on the beach. You know, um, yeah.
Which is why most of your population centers are all, you know, kind of coastal, really, right? I mean, where it's nice to live, that's where the cities have developed, right?
Yeah, I think the city's developed. If you look at Australia, anywhere there was a large river where they could float logs down and then maybe like use the water for industry.
Mm-hmm.
Um, yeah, and generally where there was water, there was a mountain, so there would be forests. So generally you'd find a port big enough on a big river where you could log all the trees and start an industry. And that forest and those mountains exist on the east coast of Australia and in the southwest, and all the other stuff is like popped up because of mining, because Australia is full of minerals. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I'm going back to your kind of your comment about being in the U.S. and having to, you know, be concerned about bears getting here. You know, one of the things that I think, you know, because the U.S. has such an extensive national park system, like we can go into these beautiful, preserved natural environments, and it can kind of feel safe, like in a way that's not actually helpful. Like
Mm.
you think you're in a national park and there's like, you know, rangers and there's paved roads and toilets and concessions, but it's like, no, like if you go too far away from that, you know, like you'll see people climbing around Mount Rainier in like flip-flops and tennis shoes because it's we're just going to the national park. But no, like if you take a wrong turn or you don't, you know, project the weather properly, like you could die if you know, got stuck out there. And so I feel like in the US, because of that, there's might be more of kind of like a Disneyfication, you know, it's just like
Oh, yeah.
it's not real, right? We're safe.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
and so I'm curious, like from an Australian perspective, like, yeah, it's not like you're gonna just step into the ocean and die from a jellyfish, but like is there a kind of more of a general awareness of potential risk that just kind of you're not like living in fear every minute, but you also have maybe more of a respect for nature? Or is, I mean, because I know wherever you live, people are amazingly to adapt, you know, whether you're in Africa or India or wherever, but there are certain climates that you have to become a little bit more just aware of like the potential for risk, not kind of just this idea of like, oh, we drove here in our car and we're going to drive home like we would go anywhere. It's like, no, you could die here. Like
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
there's not a respect for it. So how
Yeah.
do Australians respect, or what, yeah, talk about that respect, or how do Australians kind of view that level of
Yeah.
respect for nature or not? I don't know.
No, no, I get the point you're making because I remember going to driving into Yosemite and first being struck by the beauty of the big granite mountains and then coming down into the valley and being quite surprised that there was more or less a township, more or less a McDonald's, you know. So it's almost in
Right.
the middle of like this beautiful valley. There was this huge piece of infrastructure that was damaging the natural wilderness of the space. We don't have so much of that in Australia yet. It does seem to be happening in some respects in the more popular places, a bit of a domestication of wild spaces. Yeah, I don't know if it's overplayed in Australia.
Mm,
Some of the danger, I think it can be. And I think we like Australians, we sort of like we have a term here called, I don't know if you use it in America, it's called taking the piss.
mm,
So we like to have a joke at the expense of people that are maybe fearful about that. So I think maybe we let it play
sure.
out. You know, we talk about koalas, we call them drop bears to people that come along. You know, just have a joke because Australians
Right.
like we like to have a bit of a joke. But you know, it can be very, very dangerous as well. Like the wilderness in Tasmania, like you know, people slip off cliffs and die. People freeze to death. You know, every year.
Mm,
Out in the desert, people, you know, the car breaks down, you're in the middle of nowhere, you got no cell phone reception. You know, if you don't have enough water on board, you might not see someone for a few days.
mm-hmm,
And if you think I'm going to leave my car, it's like game over, you know.
mm-hmm,
Yeah, and you know, in the ocean, yeah, sure. Like, you know, I used to do a lot of spearfishing, and you know, I've been charged by bull sharks, and you know, my brother's seen multiple great whites, you know. So, um, yeah, I don't know anyone that's died from a snake attack, you know.
yeah, sure. Yeah, I mean, me neither. I mean, what cougars or whatever, but
Yeah,
that's why I'm trying to talk to folks, just to kind of get a sense of like what is your relationship with the environment. And
yeah.
coming off of my previous conversation, it and even playing out in the bonsai. And again, I don't want to push this too much. It seemed like there was some sort of like tension, I guess, like for lack of a better word, some sort of tension that existed within the bonsai community, both between sort of traditionalists, sort of fans of the exotic plants, and people like yourself who are promoting native trees, and this sense of maybe undervaluing, devaluing them as less than the sort of formal traditional species. And so yeah, I'm just trying to help understand, like when you look at, again, like the US, Australia is huge, and you just can't say like, well, it's all like this in this one area,
Mm.
because even politically, it's a different country from the Northwest to the Southeast, like different language, different accents, different political views, different cultures, and all of
Yeah,
that.
yeah.
But at the same time, there are some unifying themes that kind of most Americans kind of adhere to. And so, like from an Australian perspective, are like, how would you summarize or maybe touch on some general cultural values of Australian people?
Okay, yeah, I can see what you're trying to tease out, and I'm glad you did because it's brought me around to a thought. That is actually like it does underline a lot of things that do happen in this space, right? So Australia's very young, right? And it's, you know, there was a European invasion of this landscape. And you know, we had some pretty horrible stuff happen, as much as like what happens during a lot of colonization events. But what happened then was the people on this landmass then sort of like longed for home, right? So there was almost like a large scale terraforming of the landscape in a way that they were trying to turn it into a small version of the English landscape, or
Hmm.
you know, um, and so it does seem to be the case that for a long period of time, what we call exotic plants, or exotic things culturally, um, have had some level of reverence surrounding them. Um, you know, and I see it even running my own business here. A lot of the time, the Tasmanians don't buy my native trees; they buy my what we call classical bonsai here, or some people call them exotic trees. A lot of the time, a lot of Tasmanians will buy those from me. Um, a lot of the time, my business survives by selling native Tasmanian trees to the mainland because even though they're native, it's quite exotic to them to see this beautiful mountain tree from Tasmania. And I don't know if that has a direct correlation, but I suspect there's always like some subconscious sort of links. You know,
Hmm.
and I find it myself in this landscape. So like with a lot of us coming from, you know, Australia's wildly multicultural now, but there was a long period of time where you had the indigenous population, mainly like English, Irish, Scottish, you know, European type populations, German and that sort of stuff. A lot of Chinese in the population. Um, Yeah, so I think they had certainly a longing for home and a reverence. And it's funny when you walk on this landscape, it's so foreign to that. Um, and I feel it here when I walk into the pencil pine forest, these like relics of like an ancient landscape coniferous. And there's like this almost like a genetic link. You know, you smell the pine resin or the, you know, that sort of like piney smell on the breeze. And, you know, it's like almost this genetic memory, nostalgic memory to something else. But then if I leave Australia for a long period of time and I come back and it's a hot summer's day and I smell the eucalyptus oil on the breeze, and it's like, well, it smells like Australia, you know. And it smells. If there's a weird homeliness to that smell as well. Yeah, so I think it's interesting because Australia is so young. So like when we talk about like cultural influences, the cultural pool here to draw upon, unless you say like, you know, I'm going to draw back on to England and, you know, things like Stonehenge of my lineage or whatever. We don't really, as if you're, you know, if you're um, an imported Australian, which most of us are, unless you're an Indigenous person. Um, yeah, it's a different sort of link to the landscape and a different cultural pool that it's very like because my family lineage is somewhat like we have like convict history here.
Mhm.
And so more or less, you know, you're displaced, you're taken, you know, your family might have been taken away for stealing a loaf of bread or whatever, and you get sent to Tasmania, to Van Diemen's Land, you know? And so it all links to like your cultural heritage is gone from there, and you're sort of like more or less marooned on this foreign alien landmass. Yeah, so I think that plays into some of what the psyche of like the way we work with plants and the way we talk about exotic plants versus native plants. Yeah, and I certainly like lean into that thought process a lot because I do feel a little bit like I'm stuck on this foreign landmass and that I need to, you know, figure out what the hell's going on. And I do that by going into the wild spaces and I work with bonsai to sort of help to figure that out and build a relationship with the trees and the natural landscape and to build that culture because for, you know, 200 years we've been trying to build an Australian identity. Um,
Mhm.
you know, not talking necessarily about bonsai here, but as a whole, you know, but it's still quite shallow, you know, like very shallow, shallow pool.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I mean that's fantastic. I mean, I think that is so helpful to hear that because I think that's kind of one of the things that I've been encountering with I've been talking to people. It seems like I'm trying to figure this question. I don't have the answer to it. I think I do, but it's also one of the X factors that I'm starting to realize is time as a really critical ingredient in the ability for this kind of cultural identity to have time to actually be created. And so it seems just as much as the sort of country, the national identity. Obviously, Australia is a landmass and inhabited is predates the country of the of Australia, but same goes for bonsai. That countries that have been practicing bonsai less than others, kind of goes or go, there's almost like a natural progression. Like, and I think like anything cultural, right? There's an importation of some sort of idea or technology, material, design idea that's sort of seen from somewhere else. That's brought back to a place. It's kind of replicated, understood, and then eventually gets absorbed and somehow then expressed in a more of a unique kind of enculturated way. And so one of the common things that I've come across in European countries that I've spoken to is well, and really you mentioned John Naka. I think we all know how important he was, but I'm kind of understanding how important he was just in that global scale because a lot of people were like, oh yeah, John Naka came and then like we had bonsai all of a sudden, even though there were people probably doing it and here and there, but almost there was like after John came, there was like the early professionals then kind of followed after that, and then those professionals kind of had schools is kind of what a lot of the Europeans would refer to them, and then those schools would give rise to kind of students, disciples, whatever, and then they would kind of develop their own approach much like in China. There's different painting schools or martial arts schools, and then you can start to kind of see the schools working within the landscape, like the specific geography, because I think that's the other main component of any sort of national identity is drawing on to some degree the native plants, because right, the environment is shaping the plants that grow there, and those then give the not just the material through Yamadori but also the visual references for what the trees look like in Spain or in Tasmania or the Pacific Northwest, wherever, right? We're referencing the native environment, but then also culturally too, like this reference for Japanese. It's also like how kind of free, or I was talking to Walter Paul about kind of German Austrian bonsai, and he was like, well, most people in Germany are rule followers. Like, that's what Germany's about. We follow the rules. And so you're going to see most of the bonsai in Germany look like Japanese trees, and like that's what they're trying to follow the rules of bonsai. So you're not seeing, like, he's kind of the outlier because he's not following the rules. He's almost kind of he's like, I represent German kind of Austrian bonsai, but I'm actually like
He's such a weapon.
the worst example. So I just found that interesting too, this kind of cultural identity as something in with Australia. I did, again, how much of that's a stereotype where you talked about the initial kind of settlements as being kind of convicts and people coming from the UK that were kind of not wanted there, and then it's like, yeah, you are sent to this island, more or less. I mean, it's big, but still an island, and it's like you're not really like happy to be there. It's like, this is not my home, and like, yeah, I don't like the native stuff here. It's all like, it's not where I'm from. And so yeah, just that kind of really interesting tension that seems to exist in Australia with like, how do you feel about your native plants? It's like, well, you're having to kind of like learn to like them because you probably, you're there now, right? and
Yeah.
and so that short period of time, so like, I know there have been bonsai professionals to a certain point, like the Kirchhoffs were really instrumental, kind of in the 70s and the 80s. And I know Lindsay Farr and Lindsay Bebb, and there's just not like there has been no bonsai practitioners, but it also seems like more recently with like maybe you and Hugh, and it's like there seems like there's people that are trying to form a little bit more of like a formalized educational system that maybe places like Europe and Italy and Spain and England have had there are multiple generations of professionals deep now that have had people, kind of going that route. So now they've starting to see more of an identifiable like style that's reflective of their native plants from that environment, and then that sort of cultural reference emerging. Whereas in Australia,
Yeah.
maybe because you guys are so young, there's kind of this you're still more in the earlier phase. So maybe in like 30 years or 40 years or 50 years, there'll be more of
Yeah.
like a distinctive kind of Australian, where I think in the US, we're kind of hitting there now. Like, I think we're,
It's,
about 80 plus years post World War II. We've been doing it long enough to where now we're just now like asking these questions and trying to like answer them. Um,
yeah. 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 Yeah, it's an interesting one. Just trying to draw out the points I really want to touch on here. Yeah, because I think like, so you mentioned time to begin with, and I think time is the key as well. I think like it's very important, maybe more so with bonsai, because bonsai, one of the ingredients is time. Everyone thinks of bonsai as the medium of being a tree in a pot, but you also, the other medium, the third medium that everyone neglects to remember is time is one of the main mediums you work with as an artist in bonsai. So it's not as quick as just going and learning some, different styles of karate or whatever, where you could learn it in, if you're dedicated, you could learn it in 6 months or whatever. So I think, yeah, obviously time, population is another thing, to have a critical mass where enough trees and ideas are being shared, enough like, maybe you need 1,000 bonsai practitioners for one to rise to the top that has enough skill set and also unique individual creative force to change something culturally as an art form. So I think like the small population and how divided we are across the country. In fact, like we've got that small population in sort of southwestern Australia as a as a hub. You know, you got Melbourne in the south, Sydney sort of along that east coast, and further north, you know, you got more population, but it's somewhat divided, different climates, different trees, you know, so it does make it harder to be like a unified voice in Australia about bonsai because it's also different based on where we are. Even those things, you know, like I was just in Western Australia and still have the same trees. They're just like, you know, eucalypts, you know, tea trees, casuarinas, melaleucas. Yeah, so it's an interesting one. And I think definitely time and our population does seem to be growing. So that I think those things will contribute. I think the other thing is, yeah, we don't have like a long-standing, you know, we don't have a Great Wall of China that was built by, you know, ancestors or whatever, or, Angkor Wat or something like that. You know, this long-standing, I mean, unless you're indigenous, in which case, you know, but some of that history has also been lost. And that there's also a tension surrounding that culturally probably plays into some of the behavior Australians have. Yeah, so I think, yeah, definitely time is one of those huge things that is impacting. Um, I wouldn't say Australians, like going back to the point you were talking about with talking to Walter Paul about Germans being rule followers. Australians, yeah, pretty good, but we're pretty relaxed, you know. Not not criminals, or, you know, but like
Sure.
it's still kind of pretty free and easy, you know. You can go and, you know, as long as you're doing the right thing, you can sort of, you know, have a nice time and not be too bothered. So I don't think culturally, like, you know, we're particularly following rules, but I think it is just the fact that it's like that's what was done. This is what we will do until we do that enough, where some people go, well, maybe there should be something a little bit more behind this, and start to look at other avenues. Um, and then going to your point about like being schools and stuff in China with Penjing and whatnot, and educational facilities like driving, driving the evolution. That's certainly 100% obviously got to have an impact. And I think with respect to that, what happens is, and I know this has happened in my own work, you sort of stand on the shoulders of giants where you find someone that you respect. You know, I found the work of Michael Hagedorn and spent some time with him. And I know ideas that he had when I was there and discussions that we had when I was there opened up new avenues of thought for me to pursue within bonsai. Um, and then I see what he's done along that vein of thought, and I think, okay, well, you know, if I'm to ever like do him justice as a teacher, my role as a student is to take his ideas and run with them and see where I can progress them. And
Hmm.
then time where that's happening within a, you know, people find that person, then a group of people surround themselves around that person, and that idea and that line of thought can multiply, and you multiply that a dozen times, and you take the good and you leave the bad. I think that's where that sort of like cultural difference that you see in bonsai in China and Taiwan and yeah, to an extent now, definitely in America. Well, Americans, you guys are very individualistic and very driven to, you know, be bold and, you know, be loud, and you can see that in the bonsai. It's very bold and very loud at times, but
Hmm.
there's also people that can work in a quieter manner in America as well. Yeah, so I think in Australia, yeah, I don't think necessarily yet we have a style. But I think we are just on the cusp of clawing it, you know, just scratching it out. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, I think a couple of things there. Yeah, I think you're right. I kind of wanted to, as you're touching on your assessment of American bonsai and those sort of bigger, stereotypical, for lack of a better word, and not all stereotypes are wrong. They're helpful in us kind of identifying broad commonalities, right? We don't want to rely on them solely, but it is helpful kind of categorizing things in broad brushstrokes, which is what we're trying to do. And so I think you're right. And so what are you able, like, let's say hypothetically, do you think then if you went to like the trophy, the European bonsai exhibition, how well do you think you could go through and maybe identify the country of origin? Or, if we had a bonsai from every country in the world in a room, you know, how well do you think you could identify its country of origin just by looking at the tree? I mean, I'm sure species does thing, but we also know that those species can grow in all sorts of climates. So stylistically, yeah, like what do you think? Do you think that's possible?
I think Europe's a hard one. Um, because I think like sure there are stylistic differences between different European countries, but there's been so much Japanese importation, um, and they use trees from very similar areas. Like the Italians and the Spanish and Swiss. They're harvesting from similar mountains, similar species, and while there are different subtleties, um, I think it's unless it was a very prominent artist where I could notice their fingerprint. I think I personally would maybe struggle to pick the differences myself. I know that they're there, but I think if I put them, all the trees were displayed. Maybe if you took the names away, um, I think as well because there's still so much reverence to Japan. I think they're working very close to the aesthetic of Japanese bonsai. Maybe there's some like differences, like Spanish bonsai is very clean, very stylish, you know. But Japanese bonsai can do that as well. It depends on the artist. So I think it comes down to the intention of the artist. If they're trying to do something different and they do that, long enough and they create a body of work that's distinctive, then sure, you can tell the country of origin within Europe, even though the countries are butted up together and, you know, that stack of countries could more or less fit in one state of Australia. Um, yeah, there's definitely little cultural differences, but I think you need greater distance between. So like those spaces, I don't know if necessarily yet in
Mm-hmm.
those spaces I could pick country of origin. Maybe like if it was, German versus Spanish, you'd see because there's a distance between it. Or if you were saying European versus like, East versus West, then yes, there's a huge difference. As you start to break it down into smaller and smaller pieces, the differences become more subtle.
Mm-hmm.
Don't know necessarily if I went to the Europe, I'd for sure be able to pick out every country of origin. But for some, yes, certainly.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. But I think it's time, maybe over
Mm-hmm.
time, those differences will develop more and more. Yeah.
Yeah, I was just curious to kind of, because I think it's pretty obvious when we look at like China and Japan, again, these two oldest countries. And even if you're not a bonsai, aficionado, you could probably visually see that even if you don't know what you're looking at. But
Yeah.
yeah, it's been interesting. Obviously, countries, borders are imaginary lines that, don't literally exist. And that's what's the interesting thing with culture, right? Culture is not necessarily limited to that physical border. It goes back and forth. And same thing with the plants, right? The geographic ranges of these species are not just limited by the physical or the imaginary country boundaries. And so yeah, you're right. I mean, Italians, Spanish are pulling from similar material from similar environments. And then yeah, the individual definitely is playing that, but then also that's where I'm kind of falling back on like, well, as an individual, we are just as much influenced by our culture and the environment we live in. So
Yeah.
while the individual is like sort of like condensing all of that experience and kind of having that unique expression, like you're not going to, as much as we maybe try to imitate Japanese forms, not being Japanese, how can you ever really do it as well
Mm.
as Japanese? And I think that's another thought to maybe get your opinion on, like originally when I heard that idea when I was first starting in bonsai, it was kind of offensive to be like, the kind of an old school thought was like, well, no one could do bonsai as good as the Japanese could. And Naka was one who was actually like, no, like we should teach non-Japanese people bonsai,
Mm.
like because it was kind of this idea of like, why bother? Like, they can't do it basically. And so, but so on one hand, like it's kind of correct, like you can't ever be as Japanese as a Japanese person could because you're not from that culture and you didn't grow up there and all those sorts of things. But at the same time, so then trying to find that like that blending of it in a way where it is authentic to you, but yeah. So what are your thoughts on that in terms of like that role that culture kind of plays in you individually? Like how does that inform your bonsai approach more directly or maybe indirectly if you've thought about it?
Mm. Um, Again, sort of like I'll just touch on one last thing on that sort of previous note that I was thinking of. So maybe I'm like not the best person to comment on like European bonsai because I haven't extensively visited European bonsai growers and their gardens. And I could cheat and I could look at famous trees that I know come from certain places. Or I could look at the pots and look at I know where the potter comes from. Um, Closer to us in Australia is Asia, um,
Mm.
and I can tell which country of origin in Asia for sure the bonsai come from. Indonesia, Vietnam, um, Thailand, maybe Thai and Vietnam. The Vietnamese bonsai are quite similar.
How I'm gonna stop you then. How help me unpack that. Like, how would you describe some of those visual characteristics that you're seeing that would distinguish them? Like, what? Just give me a few of them, like the Philippines versus Thailand or Vietnam. What would you describe
Yeah,
those
okay. So
as?
like in Thailand and Vietnam, it's very similar to the Lingnan Penjing styling, like very angular, very open, you know, a lot of focus on intrigue and interest in the trunk and changes of branching. And then also a lot of very large trees that are just sort of like, potted pom-pommy style plants that more or less fall into the category of what technically a bonsai is. I think they call it Hono Bon or something in Vietnam. Um, in Indonesia, very, very different yet again, even though it's, not that far south to the southeast. The trees are very, very meticulously handled, very higher levels of ramification. The materials they're harvesting, like pemphis, have incredible movement, so the materials have offered it, but that rampant growth is handled very differently. It's handled very consistently and refined. Um, China has its obvious sort of aesthetics through Penjing. You go to Taiwan, the trees are, again, and I think climate plays a big role in some of these aesthetics between places because it's not just the trees, it's and the people that are handling them. It's the impact of the climate on what aesthetic you can draw out from the material itself. Because enough time, again, going back to time being a big component. Obviously, the trees are outdoors, and the landscape and the elements are being applied to the trees. So if you live in a warm, humid place, you can develop these very dense, compact. But it does make the trees thicker and coarser, and there's not that level of delicacy. So then you move further north to Japan from Taiwan, and the trees become a little bit softer. Maybe with the exception of black pines, which can be quite strong and powerful. But there's maybe a softness that probably comes from a slightly different climate and slightly different temperament. Yeah, so those areas, I've visited and seen the bonsai, and but again, it goes back to that first thing you mentioned is time. Those cultures have all handled bonsai for a lot longer than the Europeans have. So when you ask like in a European exhibition, could I see it? It's like, yeah, I can see elements of definitely regional voices, but not as pronounced yet because the time
Mhm.
hasn't overlaid enough.
Mhm.
I think if you spend a lot of time in those different European countries and you know what you're looking at more so than I would, then yeah, you would pick it easier. Yeah.
Mhm. Yeah, yeah, that's super helpful. Yeah, I mean, I think that's kind of what I'm trying to get at is just, can you just like, does it exist? Does national kind of styles exist? And I think they do, but it's also trying to understand why they exist, how do they exist, what are the ingredients that go into that, and understanding, also for this perspective, Australian bonsai in particular, to kind of get a sense of how to describe it. Um, yeah, that's really fascinating. Um, what was I going to say? We've got a few more minutes here. I don't want to keep you too much longer because I know you've got your day starting.
You got to get home to
Let's see
yourself.
here. Yeah, I guess have you noticed, I guess, the s- styles of bonsai, because you mentioned, learning bonsai has become much more easier globally through the internet, social media, all those sorts of things. Oh, that was the other one too. I find it interesting that you did not go to Japan to study bonsai. You went to the US to study bonsai. Why was that? Why did you choose to go to the US?
Um, I think I liked where you guys were at because you were creating a lot of bonsai. Um, I saw a lot of people go to Japan, and a lot of the work I sort of saw as more or less hairdressing for short stays, and we didn't need to learn yet how to refine trees. Well, we do. Everybody needs to know how to refine trees, but we needed some good trees. We needed some heavy hitters. And it's like, how do you create them? Well, you go to an area where a lot of heavy hitters are being created by artists that have a high level of proficiency that they've learned. And it helps to streamline the process of learning. So if I have a question, I can speak the language and I can ask directly, not watch for 3 years and try and steal the technique. I can just ask and receive. So yeah, it's similar to your concept in that previous question that we didn't get to yet about like globalization. Like one of the reasons I went to America is because I wanted to learn. I wanted to learn quickly. I wanted to learn how to create bonsai, not just maintain them. Um, yeah, and I wanted to be able to effectively communicate so that I could go to someone that had been through that strenuous, rigorous sort of training in Japan.
Hmm.
Um, because like, not that I studied with Michael for so long that I'm an expert on his work, but um, Michael's work, he works with classical trees, what you guys call exotics, and they're very much in the Japanese style. But the work that really appealed to me was the work I saw when he was working with trees from his local environment. So when I saw him take a big clump of hemlock from the mountains and I went to Mount Hood and I saw that, you know, and that was like, okay, that's your mountains, that's wild. And then I saw like the Vine Maple Tower and like it's evocative of architecture in the local area and but also feels like if I was sliding down a hill in the rainforest around Portland, there'd be vine maples and ferns. um, and so that sort of aspect of work really appealed to me because I was already working predominantly in the realm of using native species for bonsai, and I saw someone that had technical prowess, a beautiful artistic vision, and executed those well. And I wanted to learn the little missing pieces I felt that I just didn't have in the puzzle to get me across to the line where I could start to produce those trees myself. Not necessarily the same trees as Michael, but you know, using again standing on the shoulders of giants because that's what it is. It's time. Use the time he spent in Japan to learn all the time they've spent there. Then get at least some of it and bring it back, and then start to build that time here because and one of the things that was hard because like nobody could teach us what to do with our native plants really. Like this, you can't just type in, you type in black pine on Google, and this goes back to your globalization. You just, you decandle in summer and then you needle pluck and bud select in the winter. It's not very complicated. And, if you can disseminate the information, which is, the AI will do that for us now. You type in how to do this with black pine, you get that Google AI thing come up. Super easy. But with the local stuff, like there's no, now there is a little bit, but there wasn't anything as much in the past. So, um, yeah, I think the globalization concept, I think it will bring maybe a more homogenous vibe to everything. And I think in Australia, because we don't have like long-standing culture or long-standing um, history with bonsai, we're quite free to just do as we please, which is it's quite lovely. It's quite liberating, not feeling like you need to do something because if you stop doing it, the traditional art form fails. Because the moment people stop following traditional, and bonsai is a traditional art, right? So as soon as someone doesn't do it anymore, the tradition fades, becomes obscured, and it's lost, right? But we don't have that necessarily, we don't have that weight on our shoulders to
Hmm.
tradition into the future. So it's easy, we can just do whatever we like,
Hmm.
and
Hmm.
you can trial, error, fail, succeed, and that's nice, I think. And I think that is how we will tease out what our identity is. I don't think we're there yet, and yeah, I don't necessarily think that all European countries are there yet. Some work harder, have bigger populations that do bonsai, and sure, they have their own aesthetics emerging for sure. Yeah, but yeah, just rambling.
Yeah, no, that's great. I love that. Yeah, well, I think, as just to kind of end our conversation, was there anything else that we hadn't touched on that you wanted to talk about or had any thoughts on?
Um, Not particularly. Nothing that's like, I'm really screaming to get out. Yeah. But
Yeah, I think it sounds like Australian bonsai is, yeah, it's continuing to figure itself out, trying to understand your native species. And yeah, I do see examples of what you're talking about with the broadleaf evergreen forms that I am sort of coming across and kind of seeing. That's one question, I guess. If you were to sort of, as we sort of wrap up, um, if you were to kind of think of any bonsai that you've seen, either your own or somebody else's, that you feel kind of embody that, like if you could point to one to be like, that's like an Australian bonsai, that kind of could point the way towards what that might look like one day. Like, does anything come to mind as like what that could be or what tree that would look like?
Yeah, they're well, not necessarily just a tree. So one of the biggest influences for me here in Tasmania is a friend of mine called Will Fletcher. So he's an early pioneer in using native Tasmanian trees for bonsai. And I remember the first time I went into his garden, just all Tasmanian native trees, and it had a different feeling about it, something that like spoke to me in a way that a black pine never did because I have no nostalgic link to it, right? I don't know what a black pine looks like on the coast of Japan. Maybe I've seen a couple, in passing when visiting, but I don't have, I couldn't recollect what the sound of the breeze through the black pine needles on the coast somewhere would sound like or any of that, right? And when I walked into this space, I was like, this is it. This is the missing link with what I've been trying to put together of this puzzle. It's like there's no, there was no substance prior to working with, these other trees. There was a level of substance, but there was also a distinct lack in, there was something there that was missing, right? And feelings are always hard things to describe with words, right? Um, and if you have a feeling in a bonsai garden that's hard to describe with words, something is good. It's like when you think about all these words that are so important to bonsai, like, Yugen and Shibui and Ma and all these underlying philosophical concepts. It takes us a lot of words in English to explain what they are, 'cause, um, yeah, so and then when I went out into the mountains more here, and it's hard to talk about Australian bonsai from Tasmania because Tasmania is so unique.
Mm,
Um, if you're down in the lowlands, it just looks like just Australia, but you get into the mountains and there's an ecosystem out there that is nowhere else in the world. It's just in the mountains of Tasmania. There's nothing else like it.
mm,
Um, yeah, and so I don't know what that will represent as an Australian identity when that landscape is expressed through bonsai. But I just really want to show the world what's out there through this art because, like, speaking with you, I'm not sure if you would, if you tried to picture what is in the mountains of Tasmania, if you could even conjure up an image. So, um, yeah, culturally, I just want to, well, not culturally, but individually, I'd like to show that to the world, and through that, hopefully whatever cultural overlays that are subconsciously underlying will come to light. And then in the future, hopefully someone can lean on the work that I did, like I've lent on the work that Will has produced, and then that voice will become more pronounced, more
mm,
obvious.
mm.
Yeah. So
Yeah, that's really awesome. Yeah, it's almost like you're kind of like amplifying like an echo or something like that. It's like, every iteration it gets a little louder as you kind of move it along. That's really cool. Well, Jarryd, thanks so much for taking the time. I really appreciate chatting with you, and you've helped me kind of not just understand kind of what Australian bonsai or Tasmanian bonsai looks like a little bit better, and kind of the Australian relationship to it. Yeah, a very thoughtful guy. I've enjoyed listening to you talk today. So yeah, thanks so much for taking the time.
it's a pleasure, mate. Thanks for extending your afternoon after work to chat with me.
Yeah, likewise. All right. We'll talk to you later.
Thanks, Aaron.
All right. Talk to you later.
Bye.